Resting under a dry roof in Minnesota sits a heavy steel artillery piece, removed from the weather after decades as an outdoor memorial and now being restored for permanent display. Its breech, barrel, and mounting survive as a preserved artifact, entirely removed from the corrosive environment of the sea. This 4-inch naval gun fired the decisive early American shot at Pearl Harbor, its crew striking a hostile midget submarine in the approach waters before the Japanese air attack began. Yet a profound mechanical contradiction defines this weapon, because the warship that carried it into that opening engagement was later lost at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. The gun survived safely in Minnesota, while the hull was destroyed as a fighting ship exactly 3 years later. How much of the original destroyer was actually left on the vessel when it was struck, and what physical rules governed its final loss? The operational history of this specific vessel relies on extreme temporal and command symmetry. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the flush deck destroyer was patrolling the defensive perimeter of the naval base. Her newly appointed commanding officer, William Outerbridge, had assumed command just 2 days prior, taking responsibility for a fast, narrow vessel originally designed during the First World War. When a submarine periscope broke the surface inside the restricted zone, Outerbridge ordered the crew to engage, and No. 3 gun delivered the hit that fixed the ship's place in the opening minutes of the war. But naval architecture is rarely static, and fleet requirements rapidly shifted as the theater of war expanded across the vast distances of the Pacific. The demands of amphibious warfare required specialized delivery platforms, not just screening destroyers. By 1942, the original configuration of the vessel was no longer suited to the amphibious work now demanded across the Pacific. The ship was sent to the West Coast for a complete structural metamorphosis, and in February 1943, she was redesignated APD-16. During this heavy industrial refit, the original 4-inch guns were removed from their deck mounts, including the No. 3 gun later preserved ashore. The vessel returned to the combat zone bearing new anti-aircraft batteries, serving a vastly different tactical doctrine as a high-speed transport. On December 7, 1944, the modified ship was conducting high-risk patrol operations in a heavily contested Philippine bay. The immediate danger now came from concentrated air attack, and the command structure had also shifted. William Outerbridge was no longer aboard his first command. He had been promoted and was now commanding a different combat vessel, the destroyer O'Brien, operating in the same immediate tactical sector. The fleet was under heavy pressure, and the new threat was designed to drive immediate, localized, uncontainable kinetic energy directly into the engineering spaces. The historical legacy of the vessel meant absolutely nothing to the incoming flight formations. The only factors that mattered were the closing speed of the aircraft, the density of the defensive anti-aircraft screen, and the raw physics of mechanical impact. The immediate pivot from desperate damage control to intentional destruction requires a commander to suspend the primary instinct of preservation. When the twin-engine bomber struck the waterline amidships, the physical geometry of the impact doomed the hull. The vessel was originally built as a lightweight flush-deck destroyer designed for high-speed fleet screening rather than absorbing a concentrated aircraft impact. Its light hull plating offered little protection against an aircraft strike carrying fuel and possible ordnance into the primary structure. The kinetic transfer tore through the outer skin and left the internal damage beyond effective control. Fire spread from the impact point into the heart of the converted transport, cutting through whatever damage control effort remained. The ship lost forward momentum, stopped by the impact, and drifting as a burning hazard in an active combat theater. The operational imperative quickly shifted from saving the vessel to saving the crew. The evacuation protocols were executed under extreme duress but with profound discipline. Despite the catastrophic structural failure at the center line and the intense heat radiating from the engineering spaces, the crew managed a highly successful abandonment, reporting only one injury during the exit sequence. But removing the personnel did not solve the tactical problem presented by the ruined ship. A burning hulk adrift in a contested waterway represents a severe navigational danger to Allied maneuvers. It also serves as an illuminated beacon, drawing enemy aviation toward the rest of the fleet during night operations. The command decision was brutally simple. The ship had to be scuttled. The execution of this order fell to the nearest available Allied asset, which happened to be commanded by William Outerbridge. The very officer who directed the ship during its historic first engagement in 1941 was now required to destroy it. Through naval gunfire, the objective was not spectacle, but finality, to destroy the last reserve buoyancy until the sea took over. As the Allied shells struck the crippled transport, water entered through the open plating and the ship lost its last margin of flotation. Ward lost the battle with displacement, slipped below the surface, and vanished into the dark. Once the hull disappeared, how could modern technology find it, let alone prove its identity, without crossing the legal and ethical boundary around a protected naval wreck? Human divers and ordinary salvage methods face severe limits in an environment pressurized by hundreds of feet of water. At roughly 650 to 700 feet, the ambient pressure is far beyond ordinary diving work, requiring mechanized robotic solutions for safe documentation. In December 2017, a dedicated deep-water research vessel arrived in the Philippine waters to execute an acoustic and optical survey. The methodology relied on remote sensing followed by optical verification using sonar to narrow the search and a robotic vehicle to document what the sound returns could not prove alone. Acoustic systems do not produce a simple photograph of the seabed, but rather a mathematical pattern of returns. The equipment sends pulses of sound toward the bottom, measuring the intervals it takes for energy to strike a dense object and return to the receiver. The ocean floor in this region is complex, littered with geological variations and the scattered debris of massive naval engagements. The technicians analyze the acoustic backscatter, looking for straight lines, sharp right angles, and unnatural elevations that suggest human engineering rather than natural geological formations. When a significant acoustic anomaly was mapped at nearly 700 feet, the crew deployed a highly specialized remotely operated vehicle rated for a descent of 6,000 meters. Flying an ROV into a deep water debris field requires immense pilot discipline. The tether connecting the machine to the surface ship is subject to subsurface currents and extreme drag, creating complex hydrodynamic tension. The pilot must manage this tension while approaching a fragile, deteriorating metal structure, ensuring the umbilical line never snags on jagged steel plating or deteriorating mast rigging. Every robotic maneuver followed the same non-contact rule. No touching the hull, no brushing away marine growth, and no entering open wounds in the superstructure. The pilot had to hover within the water column, using powerful lighting arrays to cut through the absolute darkness and the drifting marine snow. The cameras panned across the seabed, searching for the first coherent shape. They were hunting for the legendary warship from the opening day of the conflict. But when the ROV finally illuminated the metal, the silhouette did not match the classic lines of a World War I-era destroyer. What exactly was sitting on the bottom? The flush-deck destroyer profile had been deliberately mutilated during the war to turn it into a transport, so the deep water cameras could not rely on the historic 1941 silhouette. To prove the identity of the wreck, the survey team had to cross-reference the optical data with the massive structural metamorphosis the ship underwent in 1943. The remotely operated vehicle documented the main wreckage on the seabed, but heavy marine encrustation obscured the sharp edges of the steel, turning complex machinery into featureless gray mounds. The ROV pilots were not just looking for what was there, but actively searching for what was missing from the original naval architecture. The first test was the propulsion exhaust system. The original class design required 4 prominent smoke funnels to vent the massive boilers. The historical drawings showed why the forward funnels mattered. In conversion, the forward boiler and fire rooms had been altered to accommodate troops, and the forward funnels were removed. The cameras then moved along the surviving transport geometry, looking for features consistent with the high-speed transport conversion rather than a standard screening destroyer. The altered deck layout, combined with the known removal of the 4-inch gun mounts, matched the 1943 conversion record closely enough for the team to identify the wreck as the historic vessel. The main hull had answered the primary question of location and identity, successfully completing the core objective of the expedition without ever breaking the plane of the wreckage. The main hull proved identity, but what could the surrounding seabed reveal about the violent kamikaze impact and scuttling? And why was that data permanently out of reach? The coherent main hull could only tell half the story of its destruction, leaving the investigation against the absolute limits of missing data. A kamikaze strike followed by naval gunfire could leave damage beyond the visible hull, including off-hull fragments or scattered fittings. But without a published acoustic and optical grid of the surrounding seabed, the deeper mechanical physics of the sinking remain unverified. To go further, investigators would need extensive bottom time, flying the remotely operated vehicle in tight, overlapping geometric grids to document how torn metal fragments related to blast vectors, structural failure, and separated plating. But an expedition constrained by time, depth, and a primary mandate to locate and document the vessel may not publish the kind of exhaustive surrounding field map required for that level of reconstruction. In the public record, the off-hull context remains incomplete, limiting any deeper forensic understanding of the final hours. Because the separated fragments were not analyzed, the exact kinetic forces that tore through the engine rooms cannot be reverse engineered. The engineering analysis must rely entirely on the visible exterior damage to the main hull. But the exterior blast hole only shows where the aircraft entered the ship, not how the explosive energy propagated through the internal decks. The damage control sequence, the routing of the fire, and the exact failure points of the transverse bulkheads are hidden behind the jagged blast margins. This lack of public debris context is compounded by the strict legal boundaries governing the site. Because the survey remained observational and non-intrusive, no internal cameras examined the engineering spaces. No samples were taken to test residues or measure warped framing, and no internal survey was released to calculate blast effects. The forensic timeline stops at the outer skin of the ship. With the identity confirmed but the interior physics sealed forever, what is the final operational disposition of this untouchable site? The formal declaration of identity strengthens the management record for a site already protected as a U.S. sunken military craft, shifting the focus from discovery to perpetual stewardship. The Deep Water Survey successfully achieved its primary objective. The visual confirmation of the structural modifications proved the resting place of the vessel. The success of the mission was defined by disciplined observation, and that restraint now shaped the site's long-term treatment. The preserved 4-inch gun back in the United States already provides the physical memorial. The hull on the seabed is not a resource to be harvested, but a static monument to a highly specific intersection of early conflict and late war destruction. The supreme achievement of this robotic expedition was not just finding the target, but demonstrating the restraint required to leave it exactly as it was found in the dark. The high-resolution cameras documented the final resting place, the acoustic arrays mapped the coordinates, and the heavy robotics were pulled back to the surface. The expedition closed the loop on a historical anomaly, bridging the opening engagement of the Pacific conflict with the brutal realities of its final stages. A hull that fought on the first day died exactly 3 years later and now rests under confirmed coordinates on the Philippine seabed.